Programs for the Stimson Center. It's my pleasure to welcome you all here today for a morning of expert discussions and critical exploration of the Indo-Pacific. Home to more than half of the world's people, nearly 2/3 of the world's economy, and 7 of the world's largest militaries, the Indo-Pacific has been called the world's economic and geopolitical center of gravity. And the Stimson Center has long recognized the deep security, economic, environmental, and social influence of the Indo-Pacific since our founding. Since our earliest days, Stimson has built a body of research, analysis, and engagement on the Indo-Pacific that we are immensely proud of. You'll be hearing this morning for some of the experts who have come to call the Stimson Center home, but let me just say, it was very hard to choose. We're very lucky here at Stimson to have such a deep bench of experts on the Indo-Pacific, working on some of the most critical issues across the region, from cascading environmental disasters across the Himalaya to gray zone coercive tactics that China employs to pursue its foreign policy objectives short of war. It was in recognition of this reputation of excellence in the Indo-Pacific that the Stimson Center launched our Indo-Pacific Initiative in June, which brings the full array of Stimson expertise and analysis on the region under one roof. You can learn more about our Indo-Pacific Initiative and support this work from our homepage at stimson.org. You have a packed schedule ahead of you. Besides hearing from some of our regional experts, we are honored today to welcome former Australian Prime Minister and current Australian Ambassador to the United States, the Honorable Kevin Rudd, as well as video remarks from the 8th United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. But to set the tone and tenor for this morning's discussion, we are honored to welcome Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, Daniel Kritenbrink, for keynote remarks this morning. Some brief notes for everyone joining us in person and online. This event will be recorded and available in full at stimson.org and on our YouTube page. A few of our segments will include audience Q&A, so online viewers can submit your questions at stimson.org/questions. Those of you in the room will also have the opportunity to pose your questions during the Q&A. One of our colleagues will have a microphone and will be coming around, so please hold your questions until then. With that, it is my great pleasure to welcome to the stage Daniel Kritenbrink, Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. Assistant Secretary, welcome.
Thank you so much. Honored to be here. Really appreciate it. All right. Good morning, everyone. Nice to see you all. Rachel, thank you for the very kind introduction. I thank you and Brian for inviting me here today. And I really want to recognize the tremendous scholarship, the research and programming done here at Stimson. And I'm particularly grateful for the close partnership between the U.S. Department of State and Stimson. And I also want to recognize my good friend Brian Eiler as well, someone on whom I have relied for his expertise and great advice now for more than a decade. Rachel, you've done such a great job of setting the stage. I think you've just eliminated the whole first third of my speech because in our time here today, I wanted to start by just setting the stage. Again, as the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, I believe I have the best job in the U.S. government because I'm charged with advancing American interests across what I think is the world's most consequential and dynamic region. As Rachel said, half the world's population, 60% of global GDP, 2/3 of all global economic growth in the last 5 years, 7 of the world's largest militaries, 5 of our treaty allies. America has $2 trillion in annual trade with the region. There's $1 trillion of American investment in the region and nearly $1 trillion of regional investment in the United States. It's very clear to me and to the Biden-Harris administration that America's future is inextricably tied to the Indo-Pacific. The trade numbers that I mentioned, for example, support more than 4 million American jobs, and it's clearer than ever the region's considerable promise and challenges as well. My boss, Secretary Blinken, has stated what happens in the Indo-Pacific will, more than any other region, shape the trajectory of the world in the 21st century. So in these times, we believe it's more important than ever to partner with those who share in our vision of the world and to empower our partners in the Indo-Pacific to adapt to growing challenges and seize its growing opportunities. I think the defining feature of the Biden-Harris administration's Indo-Pacific strategy is working in common cause and investing in the collective capacity of allies, partners, and friends to advance our shared vision of a region that is free and open, interconnected, prosperous, secure, and resilient. When I'm asked to boil down our Indo-Pacific strategy to one sentence, I actually do it in one phrase: allies, partners, and friends. That is the focus of our strategy. And since the release of our strategy by Secretary Blinken in 2022, we've taken a number of concrete steps to make the 5 objectives I've talked about a moment ago a reality. We're advancing freedom and openness across the region by standing up for democracy and human rights, including in places like Burma and the DPRK. We launched the Summit for Democracy, and we've held strategic consultations and dialogues with partners on democratic governance and human rights. But when we talk about a free and open Indo-Pacific, we also talk about having free and open maritime domains. That's why we stand up for international law in the South China Sea. I'll just reiterate, though, at the core of our strategy is working together with allies and partners to build connections, strengthen the regional architecture, and again, address shared challenges. We have invested deeply in developing what we call a lattice work, or a network of strong and mutually reinforcing coalitions to build collective capacity, from our engagement with ASEAN, the partners in the Blue Pacific, the Pacific Islands Forum, the Quad, and our trilateral cooperation with Japan and the ROK, and Japan and the Philippines. We're also driving regional prosperity by promoting private investment, encouraging innovation, strengthening economic competitiveness, rebuilding supply chains, and expanding economic opportunities, including through APEC and the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. A number of people have commented on America's economic and trade approach to the region. I will underscore we are excited about the work that we've achieved under IPEF, and I will just reiterate what I said at the top. We have $2 trillion in annual trade flows that lead to 4 million American jobs. We will be central to the region's future. Is very clear to me. It's also clear to me that we have doubled down on investing in high-impact infrastructure projects across the region, such as the Luzon Economic Corridor, so as to further connect and drive economic growth in the Philippines. We are bolstering regional security by strengthening and modernizing our security alliances and partnerships, increasing joint military exercises, building the ability of countries in the region to monitor their waters and cyberspace, and advancing as well the AUKUS partnership. And I would argue across the board, America's allies, our alliances are stronger than they have ever been. Lastly, we are building a stable Indo-Pacific region that is resistant to shocks and crises. We're building this regional resilience to 21st century transnational threats by strengthening the health security and COVID-19 vaccine delivery, and by mobilizing billions of dollars in clean energy, clean air, and climate projects. Now, the United States, of course, has had long-standing one-on-one partnerships and alliances with our partners, and as I've just argued, I think those alliances and partnerships are stronger than ever. But I think one of the signature achievements of our Indo-Pacific strategy is the way that we found new ways to move beyond this traditional hub-and-spoke model of diplomacy, and instead to build on top of that integrated, interconnected networks of partnerships, formal and informal. What I referred to a moment ago is building this lattice work of interlocking relationships across the region. We brought partners together in new and innovative ways, formal and informal, to strengthen the regional architecture, build capacity, and tackle shared challenges. For example, in August of '23, President Biden welcomed Japanese Prime Minister Kishida and South Korean President Yoon to an historic trilateral summit at Camp David. Together, the 3 leaders committed to strengthen cooperation on security, economic and technology issues, and global health challenges. In addition, the first U.S.-Japan-Philippines trilateral summit in April of 2024 was also an historic step forward in advancing the security and prosperity of the Indo-Pacific as our 3 democracies with shared values and a commitment to upholding international law. We've elevated the Quad with Australia, India, Japan, and the U.S. to new levels, launching initiatives to support maritime domain awareness, critical and emerging technologies, and much more. And President Biden very much looks forward to hosting the Quad leaders on September 21 in Wilmington, Delaware. We hosted the first ASEAN and 2 Pacific Island Forum summits at the White House, demonstrating our commitment to the region's formal diplomatic institutions. So again, as we build this lattice work, it's predicated on investments in our partnerships, formal and informal, and investing in the region's formal architecture. We launched the Partners in the Blue Pacific to better coordinate with like-minded partners to deliver on Pacific priorities. And we continue to build bridges between the transatlantic and the Indo-Pacific by working closely with our European partners through Indo-Pacific dialogues and NATO's engagement with Indo-Pacific partners. I'm often asked what is the biggest surprise that I have encountered in this job. One of them certainly has been the amount of time that I've spent working with Asian partners on European security matters, especially Ukraine, and also working with European partners on issues related to the Indo-Pacific. And I think increasingly, we see that security matters between Europe and Asia are indivisible. I thought Japanese Prime Minister Kishida, during his state visit earlier this year, said it best on Capitol Hill when he said, Ukraine today, the Indo-Pacific tomorrow. But again, building this lattice work across the region, across the globe, to advance our shared interests, I think is one of the signature achievements of the Biden-Harris administration. And I think our coordination has really elevated the ambition and the role of allies and partners to address our shared challenges. Now, because of our work together, we are, of course, dealing with a long list of challenges. Depending on the day you talk to me, I was discussing with Brian a moment ago, on my optimistic days, I'll give you my long list of opportunities in the region. On my more pessimistic days, I'll give you the long list of challenges that we face. The challenges we face are significant, including those posed by the PRC. But we are approaching those challenges from a position of confidence and strength, and doing so increasingly on our terms. We're locking arms with allies and partners against North Korea's destabilizing weapons of mass destruction and missile programs. Our Indo-Pacific partners have stepped forward with strong support for Ukraine in the face of Russia's aggression. And again, our European partners are standing together to hold the PRC and the DPRK accountable for their support for Russia. We're strengthening deterrence against increasingly dangerous and escalatory PRC actions in the maritime space. And we're supporting a strong chorus of international voices backing the Philippines and support for international law in the South China Sea. We've also encouraged a record number of states to call for the maintenance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait, strengthening cross-strait deterrence. The cumulative effect of these engagements and our achievements across the Indo-Pacific is to expand the breadth and depth of our ability to promote prosperity, stability, and security. Now, I've spent a lot of time talking about the Indo-Pacific region writ large, and I've shared with you our vision for the region because I want to make clear a fundamental point. We have a regional strategy of which China is a part, and not the other way around. That said, the PRC is obviously a significant actor and challenge in the region. As Secretary Blinken has stated, it is the PRC that is the only competitor that we face that has both the intent and the capability to reshape the international order. We have witnessed Beijing's provocative acts in the South China Sea, its continued pressure and use of gray zone tactics against Taiwan, its ongoing human rights abuses in Xinjiang, Tibet, Hong Kong, and across the PRC, its global campaign of transnational repression, and its use of economic coercion. Recent developments, including Beijing's economic and diplomatic support for Russia's brutal and unjustified war against Ukraine, and the PRC's increasingly dangerous and aggressive actions in the South China Sea, have only brought further into focus the fact that the PRC is and will continue to be our most consequential challenge. The United States continues to deliver on our PRC strategy of invest, align, and compete. We've made historic investments in the sources of American strength here at home, including through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the CHIPS and Science Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act. President Biden has also placed tremendous focus, as I've said here this morning, on deepening our alliances and partnerships around the world, especially in the Indo-Pacific. And I do want to underscore, when you look at our China strategy, you have to look at it in a holistic way. And I would argue that the work that we've done in aligning with our allies and partners is perhaps the most important part of that strategy. Because of the work that we've done over the last 3 years, though, building the sources of American strength at home, strengthening to an unprecedented degree our alliance and partner relationships, we believe that we are approaching the PRC and dealing with the PRC from a position of confidence. At the same time, despite the highly competitive nature of this relationship, we do recognize that intense competition with the PRC requires intense diplomacy. We are committed to responsibly managing this incredibly important and complex relationship through that direct diplomacy so as to ensure that our competition does not veer into miscalculation and conflict. And while we are, of course, competing intensely, we will also pursue cooperation with the PRC in areas where we have a national interest, such as counter-narcotics, military-to-military communications, AI risk and safety, and people-to-people ties. And in that spirit, we continue to seek to maintain open lines of communication with Beijing, even as we continue to take steps to defend our interests and our values, and we do so always in close coordination with our allies and partners. Now, let me just say a few words on looking ahead to the future in the Indo-Pacific. In the years ahead, as the region drives as much as, again, 2/3 of global economic growth, and as security issues are increasingly interconnected across Europe and the Pacific, I think that the region's prominence and influence will only grow. We will continue to identify opportunities to further develop and institutionalize this lattice work or network of partnerships that I've discussed across the region, so that these partnerships can take on even more bold and concrete challenges, take even more bold and concrete action together. We'll strengthen our efforts to address economic vulnerabilities and to close the region's infrastructure gap. We'll continue to work with partners to reduce their vulnerability to the impacts of climate change and to incentivize clean energy development. And we'll continue to collaborate with regional allies and partners to promote peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. We'll also focus on making progress on seemingly intractable issues, including supporting democracy in Burma, addressing the growing threat from the DPRK, and including the DPRK's determination to advance WMD and ballistic missile capabilities and its arms transfers to Russia. Again, in all of these efforts, we will work in common cause with our partners, those who share our vision, to address these challenges and ensure a prosperous, secure future for all countries and communities in the Indo-Pacific. We continue to believe that our work in the region is of vital importance, and you can count on the United States for its strong and enduring commitment to this vital region. Thank you so much for having me today, and look forward to taking some questions. Thank you.
Secretary Crittenbrink, thank you for those remarks.
Thank you, Brian. Good to see you.
Yeah, it's great to have you here at the Stimson Center. It's great to be here. I've known you for many years. It's been a while.
Indeed, first in your capacity as ambassador to Vietnam and now as Assistant Secretary. Everyone, I'm Brian Eiler. I'm the director of the Stimson Center Southeast Asia program and our Energy, Water, and Sustainability program. And Assistant Secretary Crittenbrink has graciously agreed to take on some questions from all of you. And we're going to take a few rounds of questions, maybe 2 or 3 at once. I ask you all to, if you ask a question, raise your hand if you have one to ask. Please identify yourself when you're asking your questions so we know who you are. And again, we'll take a few at a time. But before we get there, I'm going to start with a quick question. While you all think.
I don't know if this is working or not. You may not need it. I do want to say, Brian, thank you. It's really nice to see you. And again, thanks for your scholarship and your support and the wisdom that you've shared with me over the years.
Thank you. Thank you. And I remember we had our first meeting was a dinner in Hanoi where your staff was something like, you know, he's interested in the Mekong, but keep it fairly high level. But, you know, we got really deep into the Delta that night, and I thank you for your championship of the U.S. in the Mekong and making the Mekong a more resilient place. My question is, it's about the lattice work and the concept and the origin of the concept. You listed off numerous achievements and outcomes that all remind us how different the Indo-Pacific is and the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy is compared to 2020 and prior. Why was the lattice work the approach? And I ask this because change is coming to Washington, right? No matter how we think about what happens after November 5th and January 20th, change is going to be different. So how is the lattice work an approach that will help carry on a smart U.S. foreign policy in the Indo-Pacific into the future?
Thank you, Brian. I think that we recognized from the beginning that we wanted to demonstrate more clearly than ever before that we think our future lies in the Indo-Pacific. But I think given the nature of the challenges that I've described, I think we recognized that we will only be effective and successful in meeting those challenges if we do so together with our allies and partners. We talk about collectively pooling our knowledge, our wisdom, our resources to meet the needs across the region. I'll give you just one example. I told you a little bit about one of the surprises I had in the job was the amount of time I've spent working on European security matters as the Asia guy. But another surprise is the amount of time I've spent working on the Pacific Islands. I think we've really stepped up our game across the Pacific, recognizing our deep historical ties, cultural, historical, people-to-people, economic, deep ties that run across the Pacific. I probably have never met a group of leaders that sent a stronger demand signal for American and like-minded engagement and involvement and investment across the region. But they also made clear that although they would prefer to partner with the United States, they have real, tangible, concrete needs. And they need the United States and like-minded partners to step up and deliver those concrete benefits. And I think our conclusion was the only way to be successful was to do so collectively. So we formed this informal grouping called the Partners in the Blue Pacific, together with key friends like Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Korea, European partners like Germany and the UK and others. And I think that's made a real difference. And I think that's just one small example. I'm really proud of the trilateral work that we've done with the ROK in Japan, fueled by the historic rapprochement and the courage shown by the leaders in Seoul and Tokyo. That bilateral rapprochement has allowed us and enabled this tremendous trilateral cooperation. I talked in my speech about investing in the collective capacity of partners. That's really what I think we do on a daily basis. But when we work with our closest partners like the Japanese and the South Koreans, we're talking mostly about how the three of us invest together in others' capacity. So I think that's the conclusion that we reached. That's what's animated the work that we've done. And I think those formal relationships and informal groupings are stronger and more effective than ever before. But I will say they are focused explicitly on delivering tangible benefits. As I often argue, happy talk is not going to get it done. Probably not anywhere, certainly not in the Indo-Pacific. And that's why we work so hard at that. I hope that answers your question. And look, as you indicated, we believe that America's commitment and engagement in the region is enduring. I was talking with Brian a little while ago about some of the fundamentals that I think will be enduring across the region, like $2 trillion in trade and $1 trillion in investment going both ways. We've been an Indo-Pacific power for more than a century. I'm confident that will endure as well. So those fundamentals won't change, but we do want to try to institutionalize and solidify these engagements more than ever before.
Thank you. Well, let's turn to all of you. We've got a great packed house here. We're going to possibly take some questions online as well, right here in the front. Go ahead. Hi, can you wait for the microphone? Thank you.
Hi, Brian Wolski with Foreign Policy for America. I had a question. You didn't mention the UN or multilateralism, despite talking about lattice work and otherwise. So I'm just wondering, where does the UN and the UN system fit into the U.S. strategy to the region?
Question. We're a few at once. How about over here?
Thank you, Ken Moriyasu from Nikkei Asia. Right now in Japan, there's leadership for the LDP leader. One of the leading candidates, former Defense Minister Shigeru Ishiba, has suggested an Asian NATO, kind of a collective security in the region. My question is, this lattice work that you're building, does it have some kind of collective security down the road? Thank you.
Great, let's do those two. Look, we are big believers in multilateral diplomacy, and I focused in the region mostly on the formal regional institutions in the Indo-Pacific like ASEAN and the PIF. But certainly, we're big believers in the UN as well. Your question is timely. We'll all be in New York for the UN General Assembly high-level week next week. I referred to it as diplomatic speed dating on steroids. But it's a tremendous opportunity to show our support for the UN, our partnership with the UN, including on key matters in the Indo-Pacific. And it's the world's finest forum and venue for getting work done on the margins as well. And look, just maybe one small example. We'll certainly be working with the UN Special Envoy on Burma while we're there, just as one small example of the work we'll be doing next week that's focused on the Indo-Pacific. I appreciate the question. To my friend from Japan, look, I'd say before I say much about the LDP election, I do want to recognize the historic contribution that Prime Minister Kishida has made to Japan, to rapprochement between Japan and Korea, and to taking the U.S.-Japan alliance to unprecedented levels. I think it's natural for us to focus on what I've discussed here today, building this lattice work or network of relationships. But I think it's too early to talk about collective security in that context and more formal institutions that way. I think what we're focused on is investing in the region's existing formal architecture and continuing to build this network of formal and informal relationships, and then we'll see where that goes.
Hunter.
And maybe one final comment, just so people don't think I'm commenting on the Japanese election. We look forward to working with whomever is elected, and I'm confident that whoever is prime minister is going to be great for the U.S.-Japan alliance. Just want to get that in. Thanks.
Hand up.
Thanks, Brian. And thank you very much, Mr. Assistant Secretary. Hunter Marston with 9-Line and Australian National University. You mentioned democracy in Burma and working with allies and partners in the region to encourage a restoration or resumption of democracy in that country. It's easy to criticize the lack of progress there given the intractable crises. But I'm wondering, given the Burma Act empowers the U.S. government to do quite a bit more with U.S. policy levers, what more could you envision a U.S. government under either successive president doing to support democracy in Burma?
We'll do one more. Right here in the front.
Thank you, Mr. Crindenberg. I'm Jia from Caixin Media in Beijing. Yes. So my question is, so a few weeks ago, I went to Miss Susan Rice's event, and she said something that she wanted Jeff Bader to be the U.S. ambassador to China, but it didn't. But she felt it's a pity, and I just wonder. What do you envision, because you've been posted in the Beijing embassy before, and what is your vision for U.S. and Chinese ambassadors to each country's role in the next 5 years? Because I think it's changed a lot in the past 10 years. And for example, Ms. Rice also said something that the current U.S.-China intense diplomatic efforts are just maintaining the basic hygiene of the bilateral relations, including the mill talks or AI talks. So how can we make the current diplomatic talks more substantial? And is the two important roles of the country's ambassadors how can they play a more significant role? Thank you.
Great questions. Thank you. Let me start with the Burma question. Again, we're now more than 3 years since the coup d'etat and this tragedy that has befallen Myanmar, and the repression and the violence and the killing of civilians carried out by the junta is deeply disturbing and unacceptable. And that's why the United States, together with other like-minded partners, we've imposed, I would argue, an unprecedented series of sanctions on the regime, particularly to cut off funding sources for the regime and the regime's military that is used to carry out this violence. We've made very clear from day one that our priorities are stopping the violence, releasing political prisoners, ensuring that there's an increase of humanitarian aid into the country and that it actually gets to the people that need it. And also, as we talk about trying to restore a path to democracy, trying to compel the regime to engage, signal some willingness to engage with the opposition. Now, we haven't seen that happen yet. We're certainly strongly supportive of ASEAN and the ASEAN 5-point consensus. We're supportive of efforts by other key international partners, including international institutions like the UN. But I think the focus has to be on those results. But as you indicated, our strategy is predicated on more than just applying pressure to the regime. It's also focused on supporting aggressively the many democratic actors and actors in the opposition. You've seen us take some steps in recent weeks. You'll see more work on that front. I'm really excited as well that my good friend and the new counselor in the State Department, Tom Sullivan, will also help play a leading role on engaging and supporting the Burmese opposition. And we're certainly stepping up our efforts there as well, building cohesion, engaging in support so that when the day comes, we hopefully have a number of civil society actors and democratic groups that are ready, willing, and able to invest in a better and democratic future in Myanmar. And I will state very clearly as well, we use the limited channels we have to the regime to send those same signals. There is a better path that's available to the regime if it seizes that opposition and takes the steps that I've outlined here. Now, on China, thank you very much. Big fan of Caixin and still have a lot of friends there. I appreciate your question. Susan Rice is one of my former bosses. I'm a huge fan, and she's a great American who's done a lot for American diplomacy, and including our strategy vis-a-vis the PRC. You mentioned my friend Jeff Bader, God rest his soul, great American diplomat, and someone who really shaped America's China strategy in very profound and effective ways. I think that the role of our diplomats and our ambassadors remains central to the U.S.-China relationship. I think we have very capable ambassadors. I think Nick Burns is a world-class diplomat who's doing a tremendous job representing the United States in Beijing. And my friend Ambassador Xie Feng here in the United States, many of you probably know him. I've known him for decades. I think diplomacy is still vital to this relationship. I mentioned that the U.S.-China relationship is probably the most complex and consequential relationship in the world. It's highly competitive. We have a long list of challenges that we're working through. You mentioned in maybe what struck me as a slightly critical way that we're simply performing sort of basic hygiene, I think you said. But let's not underestimate the achievement of making sure that we have channels of communication between Washington and Beijing and that we're doing everything possible to reduce the risk of miscalculation that could inadvertently veer into conflict. I think that's our first and our top priority when it comes to diplomacy. I thought maybe the most dangerous period that I had seen in my career in U.S.-China relations was maybe, I guess it would have been, was it a year and a half ago? We had the balloon incident that everyone is so familiar with. Things were as tense as they'd been between Washington and Beijing in a long time, and we barely had any channels of communication whatsoever. Now, if we fast forward a year and a half from there, this relationship is as complicated as ever. We have deep and fundamental concerns with a range of Chinese actions that I've discussed in my remarks. But I think compared to a year and a half ago, following the Woodside Summit in San Francisco last year, our channels are open. My boss, Secretary Blinken, was in Beijing in April. He met with Director and Foreign Minister Wang Yi in Vientiane just a few weeks ago. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has continued his important engagements. And I think as the National Security Advisor stated in Beijing, you'll continue to see engagement at the leader level. So even despite all of the challenges in the U.S.-China relationship and the fundamental concerns that we have with China, I think diplomacy with China is more important than ever before, because if you're going to responsibly manage that competition and you're going to prevent the risk of miscalculation, you have to talk to one another. And our ambassadors and our world-class diplomats stationed at our embassy in Beijing will continue to be central to that effort. I spent 8 years at our embassy in Beijing. I may be biased, but I think they still do world-class work. Thank you. Thank
thank you all for your questions. Assistant Secretary Crittenbrink has a busy schedule ahead of him, but we're really grateful for the
Thank you,
time
Brian.
with us today to answer these questions in a candid and on-record manner. We look forward to welcoming you to the Stimson Center. But before you go, I just want to congratulate you and the team. You know, I've mentioned it to Kurt before, I mentioned it to you, that again, the Indo-Pacific and U.S. Indo-Pacific looks very different from how it looked in 2020. Much more strategic, much more constructive, and the U.S. is a positive force for norms and values in the Indo-Pacific. And I want to congratulate you on that mission. Well achieved.
Thank you, Brian. And thanks for what you do and for all of our friends here at Stimson do. Thanks for having me here today. Honored to be here. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Hey, great to see you.
All right, well, good morning and welcome from my side. My name is Elizabeth Threlkeld, and I am the Director and Senior Fellow for the South Asia program here at the Stimson Center. It really is a pleasure to be here, to have you all with us today, and a big thank you to Assistant Secretary Crittenbrink for setting the scene so thoughtfully this morning. We have a bit of a tall order as we dive into this panel. We have around 30 minutes or so, give or take, to try to unpack some of the biggest challenges facing the Indo-Pacific region today. Might be a fool's errand, but we'll give it a try. And I'm especially pleased to be joined by a few of my colleague experts on the Indo-Pacific. I have to say, I don't remember the last time that all of us were in one place together at one time, which probably speaks to how frequently we're out in the region talking to folks. So this really is a pleasure, and I look forward to learning from all of you. So I will start on my left here with Jenny Town, who's a Senior Fellow and Director of Stimson's Korea Program and 38 North. To her left, as you all know, we have Brian Eiler, Senior Fellow and Director of our Southeast Asia Program, as well as our Energy, Water, and Sustainability Program. Then Yuki Tatsumi, Senior Fellow and Director of our Japan Program and Co-Director of our East Asia Program. Her fellow co-director of the East Asia Program and director of our China program, Senior Fellow Yun Sun, bringing out the end of the panel. So welcome to the stage, all of you. We're going to focus on doing a couple of things this morning that I think Stimson does particularly well. So we're going to be reactive to respond to news that's happening in the region. And we're also going to be proactive to look forward a bit and set the scene for what we expect in the months to come. So let's start with that rapid response portion. I'm going to ask each of you to take 3 minutes, recognizing that is not enough time at all. So keeping it focused and to the point, but we're going to explore some issues around the great power dynamics, competition that have unfolded in the Indo-Pacific just in the last days and months. So quite timely here. And I'm going to start, Jenny, with you. Some news we saw just before the weekend. The release of photos by North Korea showing a rare glimpse into a weapons-grade uranium enrichment facility. We saw North Korea's leader visiting the facility, inspecting long rows of centrifuges, and your team did some excellent work analyzing those photos. Help us understand your sense of what North Korea was trying to signal with the release of those photos, the timing, the strategy that might be there. Is there any implicit message trying to keep North Korea on the agenda as we head into the election?
Well, thanks, Elizabeth, and I share the sentiment. It's great to be on the stage with our colleagues who we don't see very often, especially all together. So it's great to be part of this event. I think we all know North Korea is not very forthcoming with what they're working on, especially in their WMD programs. But once in a while, they let us know. And they let us know because they want us to know what they're working on, when they've made certain key achievements, and in order to try and create some greater credibility to their statements and to their capabilities and to their plans. And I think part of it is also just to remind the world not to underestimate what North Korea can accomplish, even with meager means, especially when trying to achieve, especially when they have the will and the ability to achieve military technology goals. What we learned from the pictures really is that, one, North Korea has ample capacity for enriching uranium, enough to enable significant growth to their nuclear weapons arsenal over time. But anyone who was surprised by this hasn't been paying attention to North Korea over the past several years. We have known that they've had an enrichment program for decades. We have known that they continue to work on it. There's at least 5 suspected sites outside of the Yongbyon, the main research facility, that are suspected to also be enrichment related. And so this idea that suddenly we're seeing that they have ample capacity really isn't a suddenly see. It is, although, I think for us researchers, we are all salivating at actually seeing the pictures of it because we don't really get that access. I think what was surprising, though, is looking at North Korea's centrifuges themselves and the idea that these are now more advanced centrifuges than what we've seen in the past. We knew they had the P2 type of centrifuges in their original program and in their main facility at Yongbyon, of which were observed by Sig Hecker and his Stanford delegation back in 2010. Well, this is not what we've seen now, and this is a North Korean, presumably North Korean design centrifuge, more advanced with greater capability. And I think it's really a reminder of how extensive North Korea's WMD programs have become, and that denuclearization, if that remains the core of our policy and other countries' policies, is an enormous task. Both in material terms, but even bigger in terms of affecting North Korea's political will to continue.
Thanks so much, Jenny. Yoon, I'm going to come to you now. Another topic that's been in the news, you might have seen, China and Russia just concluded 6 days of military exercises in the Sea of Japan. They called it the Northern Interaction 2024 exercise. And notably, Russian President Vladimir Putin termed it the largest exercise of their kind in 3 decades between the two sides. So, we've heard quite a bit about China's support for Russia in the context of the war in Ukraine. And I wonder if we can flip that script and get your sense of what the Russia-China partnership might mean for potential cooperation in the Indo-Pacific theater in a future contingency. Curious for your thoughts.
That's a great question. Well, for the Russia-China interaction, we have seen that in the past few years, Russia adopting positions, for example, in support of China's claim in the South China Sea. One example is in July of 2016, when the international arbitration about China's claim in the South China Sea came out. Russia not only came out to support China's position, they also co-staged a live-fire military drill in the South China Sea to demonstrate that support. There's always been a question as for if there is a Taiwan contingency, what role Russia may or may not play. When Putin was asked that question a few years ago, but this was before the Ukraine war, his answer was, "Well, I believe the Chinese have enough wisdom not to have a war in the Taiwan Strait." But it does leave a curious question as for what type of strategic distraction that Russia will be playing in the event of a Taiwan contingency. And similar in the case of North Korea, right? Jenny and I were in Beijing last week, and we hear how the Chinese are talking about, well, we think that North Korea is not going to stay dormant if there is a Taiwan contingency. So I think Russia definitely plays a role there. In terms of the China-Russia alignment, I think primarily it's a strategic alignment to present a coalition that is not necessarily an alliance, which indicates mutual defense. I think the two countries, they support each other strategically. They will find ways to support each other in the event of, for example, a military crisis, economically, militarily, and politically and diplomatically. But it does not indicate mutual defense. I think that's the most important piece when we come to assessment of China-Russia collusion in the Indo-Pacific. That's an important factor to bear in mind. Thanks.
Yuki, I want to come to you now. Some other recent news we've seen out of the 2+2 meeting with U.S. and Japan at the end of July. There was a pretty significant agreement. The two sides agreed to upgrade U.S. forces Japan to a joint force headquarters, which was something that Defense Secretary Austin called one of the strongest improvements in our military ties with Japan in 70 years. Yuki, can you give us a sense of what the change means and how it could impact U.S. and ally capacities in the Indo-Pacific?
Thanks, Elizabeth, and good morning, everyone. So that's an excellent question. Upgrading the authority of U.S. forces in Japan has been a long-standing issue within the in the alliance. On the Japan side as well, that how they can have a more streamlined, more joint in the sense that we do. And they had their answer last year by standing up the what we now call JJOC, Japan Joint Operational Command. So basically, this is kind of more of a reciprocal action or decision made by the U.S. side, but this is so much more significant. I mean, I'm not here to say Japanese decision was insignificant because it's quite so. But on the U.S. side, if you think about already the force laydown in the Pacific, you have Indo-Pacific, we have a U.S. forces in Korea, and just in Japan as well. Japan is a home for 7th Fleet and 3rd Maritime Expeditionary Force. So balancing all these high-level operational command has always been a challenge for Indo-Pacific. So now we're adding U.S. Forces Japan Joint Operational Headquarters into the mix. So I think details, a lot needs to be worked out, but this definitely does signal the deepening of the defense cooperation between not just with U.S. and Japan, but Assistant Secretary Crittenbrink talked about some of the trilateral relationship, U.S.-Japan Philippines, U.S.-Japan Australia. So one of the hallmarks about Japan's foreign policy over the last 10 years, I would say, since late former Minister Prime Abe came back to the office in 2012, is really investing Japan's own effort to connect those alliances. So Japan has put in significant investment in its relationship with the Philippines and Australia, both of which has really led to the really institutionalizing the security partnerships. So that's really, that really kind of contributes to that as well.
Thanks so much, Yuki. Brian, coming to you now. We've been focused a lot on hard security in the conversation so far, and one of the things I so appreciate about the work that your program does is you also focus on non-traditional security issues. And one of the ways that you have been so engaged in Southeast Asia is through the Mekong-U.S. Partnership Track 1.5 policy dialogue. And I wonder if you could give us a sense of what you've been hearing from ASEAN countries that you're working with in those conversations, how their views on the Indo-Pacific are evolving, both in terms of geopolitics, certainly, but also the non-traditional issues that drive so many of the conversations in that region.
Sure, great question. Our MUSP, Mekong-U.S. Partnership Track 1.5 dialogues have been ongoing since 2020, and we'll be having hosting our ninth next month in Bangkok on the topic of online scam operations and cyber-enabled crime or combating cyber-enabled crime in mainland Southeast Asia, which has become, it's proliferated in ways that no one can imagine. And Americans here and others around the world are being scammed and brought into these they're losing their homes and their life savings to many of these criminal operations that are coming out of Southeast Asia. So the Southeast Asian governments particularly are asking for help with prevention and regulation, just as the United States and those outside of Southeast Asia are thinking of ways to prevent and mitigate. So that's one area of kind of newer focus, I would say, or more concerted focus, say, from the United States and external development partners on engagement with Southeast Asia. With that policy dialogue, we do things from the bottom up. It's a really unique process where we bring government and non-government stakeholders together to spend 2 or 3 days together talking about a particular thematic issue and identify the challenges and the needs that the U.S. can then engage in the region. And I'm happy to say that there have been a number of policy recommendations that come out of that process that then show up in White House pronouncements, say with the U.S.-ASEAN Special Summit a few years ago and in other instances, or USAID interventions. So those reports that are produced out of that, they're kind of a wish list of new interventions and engagement opportunities for Southeast Asia, for mainland Southeast Asia. And they're derived by the people that attend, the government and the non-government stakeholders that attend. So it's a unique approach to finding new ways of engagement and strengthening U.S. action and foreign policy in the region. One thing that we always hear from stakeholders and actors is that the U.S. is very much welcome to bring new ideas and to assist with problem solving. Sometimes the U.S. is too much problem solving focused, right? ASEAN tends to be more about being there and participating and enforcing a regional identity and bringing the U.S. into that identity. And then also importantly, we're still continuing to hear that the great power competition indeed is something that's playing out in Southeast Asia. But whatever comes, the Southeast Asian countries say, don't force us to choose. And at the same time, many of them engage in what we call the hedging and balancing approach to the great power competition. Elizabeth, I'm going to turn it back to you to provide some observations on things happening in South Asia.
Thanks so much. Wearing my South Asia expert hat, taking off my moderator hat briefly. Actually, this is a really busy week, and I think some of the events that have been happening in the U.S.-India partnership, but also in the Quad, are worth a look for where U.S. engagement in the region is going. So we saw back on over the weekend, there was a meeting in India between the Deputy CEO of the Development Finance Corporation with her Indian counterparts on a range of development finance issues. DFC is heavily invested in India, so that's kind of one pillar of the partnership. We're also coming out of a session of the 2+2 intersessional that was held earlier this week. So these are the interim meetings between senior officials from the U.S. and Indian sides, where based on the statements we have out of that meeting, they really addressed a range of issues across the partnership. Anytime we get these readouts, it's pretty expansive in terms of the territory that's covered. So a reminder that those conversations keep on rolling. And significantly, as Assistant Secretary Quentin Brink mentioned, we are looking forward to the Quad Summit, which is happening later this week in Wilmington, Delaware. It's the first time that President Biden is going to be hosting at his home. And this was a little bit of a switch. So we were anticipating in 2024 that India was actually going to be hosting the Quad dialogue. But the U.S. and India did a switcheroo because the two other leaders were already going to be in the U.S. for the Summit of the Future. There's high-level week happening at UNGA. So this was a time when schedules aligned, and we're going to see them sit down together this weekend on Saturday in Delaware. So we'll be on the lookout and watching closely for the readout. There has been some reporting that we might see movement in terms of joint Coast Guard and maritime police patrols across the Quad and the Indo-Pacific to address a couple of issues. So illegal fishing is one, and general maritime security. So if you thought that was rapid fire, if we can go even faster in this next round of questions. But let's look ahead. So believe it or not, yesterday marked 50 days to go ahead of the U.S. presidential election in November. We have a reputation in the U.S. of assuming the world, all eyes are trained on Washington. I think that is true to an extent when it comes to this election. There's a lot of interest that I'm certainly hearing from counterparts in South Asia. So I will be curious to hear from you all very briefly, maybe some prognostications in terms of what we can expect headed into a next administration. We're going to have a new president one way or another. What do you see ahead in terms of a potential Indo-Pacific strategy, seizing opportunities, managing current and potential future risks? Help us write a memo to the incoming administration for what they should be focused on. I will start here again. Jenny.
Well, thanks, Elizabeth. Obviously, on the Korea side of the equation, and especially on the North Korea side of the equation, because it's the most complicated and something we give a lot of thought to. But there's no easy answers here, and there's no specific recommendation of if we do this, North Korea will suddenly become responsive and see value and really buy into it. But at the same time, doing nothing is a losing strategy. So I think a couple of principles for either the Harris or the Trump administration to keep in mind going forward. One is that we cannot look at North Korea in isolation of global trends and geopolitical realities. And this is something in the past that we've tended to do of really looking at North Korea in isolation as a very specific problem. But there's too much, North Korea doesn't exist in a vacuum. There's a lot of the global trends right now, such as great power competition, Cold War alignments, that are really, and big power nuclear arms racing that really work to North Korea's favor. And despite being a small, poor country, it has a real outsized influence on global power dynamics as seen by the war in Ukraine, as well as how it drives security dynamics in the Indo-Pacific. But I think the second and the most important principle for the new administration to keep in mind is that, North Korea's risk tolerance towards the United States is much higher than the US risk tolerance towards North Korea. And that's always going to put us in a disadvantageous position because it means, again, that doing nothing isn't going to make the situation better. Waiting for North Korea to change its mind or come to different conclusions isn't going to work itself out and is high risk in and of itself because North Korea has shown both the will to up the ante and the will to follow through on that as well. And we're going to talk about some of those developments later this morning in our quickfire session. But those realities really need to be considered by either Trump or Harris when thinking through a new strategy for North Korea.
So much, Jenny. Yun, if I can come to you on the China front.
Well, there's no overemphasis of China in the U.S. strategy or the Indo-Pacific strategy. I would say that we are in a stage of a great debate about China, and I think that comes a lot in this election. A couple of issues that are being actively and heatedly debated includes what is our endgame? What is the vision of victory? What are we trying to achieve here? Are we trying to eliminate China? Are we trying to coexist with China? And if so, what is our game? There's also a debate as for whether China has peaked. Probably have heard this quite repeatedly, that China is over the hill, now it's going downhill. Well, if it is, then what does that mean? And if China's economic slowdown is indeed a sustainable trend, what is the implication for our strategy? Do we see China as a losing party? Like someone would say that we already have our foot over their throat. Why would we let go? Or we try to seek that if China now can be a target of our coexistence. There's also a debate as for, I think this is particularly obvious between the first Trump administration and the Biden administration, the debate as for whether the China problem is a regime type problem, it's a CCP problem. That it's not about China, it's not about Chinese people, they're all good, but Chinese Communist Party is a problem. And last but not least, there's also a question as for whether this is a Xi Jinping problem. That whether Xi Jinping as a top leader represents a deviation of China's track or is actually a return to the normalcy in terms of China's trajectory. So I don't think that we have seen a clear answers in terms of these questions or these debates. I think they're going to continue to play out, but the result of the election certainly will decide largely the trend of what the answers by the next administration will be. And that will also have significant impact over the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy. But last but not least, I will just mention one more factor, which is since the beginning of the Ukraine war and also since the Gaza crisis, we see that U.S. being put in different directions, right? Especially in terms of the Indo-Pacific strategy, I think there is a question from the region that, are you still focused on this? Is this still a priority? Or you're so distracted that you are spread so thin that now we're in a holding pattern. Well, Dan has given us his clear answer, but I think from the region, there are still those questions being asked And I think that also is going to have significant impact over our China strategy. Thanks.
Beyond Yuki?
Yeah, so like everybody else, Japanese watch with great anxiety the outcome of the presidential election. I would probably say my friends in Japanese media is probably one of the best follower outside of the U.S. media about ebbs and flows of presidential election. But that is partly, especially at this moment of juncture, because Japan is also about to go through their own leadership transition. It's about to choose a new party leader next week. Prime Minister Kishida, when he comes to Anga, that will be his farewell speech to the international stage. So that election also matters because one of the dynamics now that are at play here is, of course, all politics are local. They want to win the election, next election, but then also they look at Washington and who will be the better matchup to either of these candidates. So one of the great anxiety pre-President Biden's announcement to not to pursue the re-election was Japan no longer have Prime Minister Abe, who was a master handler, shall I say, of President Trump. And minus him, who would be able to fill that role? But now, with the race becomes so much more competitive, so much closer, question shifts in a different direction. This time, two candidates, of course, they represent ideology difference, but then also they also represent generational difference, and that really reflects. If you look at some of the top candidates of the ruling party, it really it speaks to both sides of the equation. So those are all coming into play. One of the things that Japan does closely watch out for is what kind of attitude that each administration might have on the foreign direct investment. Yeah. So. I would just say Nippon style. That's enough to say. And I'll leave it at that.
Thanks so much. Brian, your very quick thought.
Sure. Three things that won't be changing into 2025 worth engaging on. One, we've talked today about the conflict in Myanmar. That will still continue into 2025. And there is a deep need for a smarter U.S. strategy there. There's a deep need to engage with the new Thai administration, to have the Thais rethink the way that they're engaging in Myanmar. We do great work at the Stimson Center on Myanmar. Yoon and her team, and now Steve Ross with the Rohingya project, are projects to watch for ways forward. Second, climate-related disasters. Typhoon Yagi just hit the region, mainland Southeast Asia. It was the worst storm in decades. It raged over Hanoi in northern Vietnam, and then the floodwaters came, and there were the worst floods seen in Hanoi in a long time, extreme devastation. The typhoon passed over the Mekong region, and many parts of the upper Mekong in northern Thailand and Laos flooded in ways that had never done so in decades and years. And then the rains passed over into Myanmar. 250,000 people were displaced. These are only going to happen more frequently. And the typhoon revealed gaps in early warning and forecasting, in anticipatory action, and the need for aid and relief. And the United States and partners and friends can play a role in that. And the third is natural resource depletion. In the Mekong, Cambodia relies on the Tonle Sap's fishery for its food security. The world relies on agricultural productivity from the Mekong Delta for protein and other agricultural products. The seas of Southeast Asia are the most productive in the world for marine fisheries. And these resources are all being depleted by overuse, by poor practices, bad practices, illegal practices. And there's a great need for regulation and conservation efforts in those areas. And regardless of the outcome of this election, many opportunities for continued engagement.
Thanks, Brian. Just briefly on the South Asia front, it's a region, and particularly with the U.S.-India partnership, where we've seen remarkable continuity over the course of the last 4 or 5 administrations, Republican, Democrat. It's really been a process of building momentum. I think the Biden administration has certainly taken that forward. But there is a long agenda in that partnership. That's a really encouraging thing in some respects, but it's a long to-do list at the same time. And so I think with whichever, if it's a Biden or a Harris or Trump administration, I would expect that continuity to continue. But really, the question of follow through on the initiatives that have already been staked out is going to be key. And I think a question too of have we already picked and harvested the low-hanging fruit in the relationship? Where do we really go from here that would be a significant step forward? The rest of the region, there are other issues as well, of course. We've just seen a run of elections, a change of government in Bangladesh that's still up in the air, and so the new administration will face some challenges and potential opportunities in South Asia outside of that U.S.-India partnership, and managing the bilat with India's regional relationships and the U.S.'s own bilateral and regional relationships will be a useful opportunity, but also potentially a challenge for the administration. So with that, I think we've covered a lot of ground, really indebted to you all for making us smarter this morning. It's a pleasure and a privilege to get to work with you day in and day out at the Stimson Center, and so glad that we could welcome you all to this conversation too. I believe we are taking a quick break here, if I am not wrong. So stretch, we have some refreshments outside, and come back shortly for the next session. Thanks so much.
Okay. And did Dan impart great wisdom?
I'm sorry.
Did Dan impart great wisdom?
He did indeed. It was all is good. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. If you could take your seats. My name is Brian Finlay. I'm the president and CEO here at Stimson. Thank you all for being here. It is a great pleasure to welcome the Honorable Dr. Kevin Rudd here this morning. This is a man of very few accomplishments. Really has coasted through much of his career, as you are all aware. He has served twice as Prime Minister of Australia. In the intervening time, he served as that country's...
I look really old in this photograph.
We can talk... Well, I think you look great, Ambassador. You look great. In the intervening time, he served as that country's Foreign Minister. He has been a long time China watcher, China analyst. He was, of course, the inaugural president of the Asia Society Policy Institute in New York. In 2020, he was appointed the president and CEO of the Asia Society, where he managed global operations for that organization. He started his diplomatic career in 81. That wasn't all that long ago. In 1981, where he served in Sweden and, of course, in Beijing. We're going to talk a little bit about that today. He's the author of numerous books, including a book about to be released next month called On Xi Jinping, which I think the title is self-explanatory. You can go on Amazon.com today and pre-order that, as I did yesterday, for the low price of $29.99, Ambassador.
And as Australian ambassador, I cannot self-promote.
I will do it for you. I'm not, and incidentally, I'm not collecting any royalties from hawking this book. Ambassador, a big welcome to the Stimson Center. Thank you for being here.
No, thanks for having me, and congratulations on the great work which Stimson continues to do in your expanding focus on the Indo-Pac.
Thank you, sir. So let me give you a little run of order of battle here today. We're going to take the next 30 minutes or so to do a deep dive into some Indo-Pacific dynamics. We'll reserve some time at the end for some questions from the audience. For those of you that are tuning in online, and there are many, Ambassador, in addition to a packed room here, you can go online and at www.stimson.org/questions and submit your questions online. We will collect those for the Ambassador. We'll also have an opportunity to collect some questions from here in the room. But let's get started, Ambassador. I want to start with the subject of your new book, which explores, I think, the significant change that we have seen in China's ideological worldview, if you will, under Xi Jinping. You have previously written that, quote, "The West ignores Xi's ideological messaging at its own peril." So I want to start with a little bit of let you riff here for a minute and talk a little bit about what you see as some of the most critical lessons learned or to be learned or that should be learned from the president's ideas and the impact that those ideas are having on China's foreign policy.
I think if we're trying to make sense of the Chinese Communist Party and its macro policy direction, either domestically or internationally, it's a fundamental discipline to understand the central role of ideology. You don't have to be a student of the CCP, although I am, back to 1921 to understand how ideology, in many respects, becomes the precursor to changes in policy, which become the precursors to changes in behaviour. And I think there has been a long-standing pattern of this throughout the party's history. People often think in the collective West that, ideology, schmideology, why worry about that stuff, And often there's an implied view that the CCP doesn't take ideology seriously in itself, that it's all some convenient, as it were, theological facade around what the actual policies and posture are of the Chinese state. That's not my understanding if you read carefully the party's history. Take, for example, the period of Deng Xiaoping and through Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, reform and opening, Gaigo Kaifang, that whole period. It really has its intellectual and ideological antecedents, not just in the reaction to Mao, but if you look at the Party Congress in 81, 82, redefining what the Marxist-Leninists call the central contradiction, that is away from class struggle towards what they call unleashing the factors of production in order to reduce poverty in the country. It was this ideological decision to change their internal analysis within the paradigm of historical materialism and dialectical materialism that this now constitutes the central challenge, or what they say is contradiction, Maodun, which then provides the ideational underpinnings for a push towards markets domestically, a push towards markets internationally, and a view of the world that China shall therefore work within the existing international rules-based order to maximize its productive forces. That was the orthodoxy for 35 years, until 2017. And if you look at the party's communique coming out of the 19th Party Congress that year, in one section of the communique, it redefines the central challenge for the first time since '82. And it redefines the central contradiction for the first time since '82. And it says that instead what we're now dealing with are the challenges of unbalanced development. That is the overreach of reform and opening, the creation of all these social and economic consequences and political consequences which we, the party, are no longer comfortable with. So if people ask the question, why did China's economic policy settings post-2017 start lurching towards the Marxist left? The antecedents lie in the analysis, frankly, in the party's documents of the 19th Party Congress, that they reached a conclusion, driven by Xi Jinping personally, that it was time to push, as it were, the centre of gravity back towards the Marxist and Leninist left. So that is why I think ideology is important. It's when you look at what the degree of change under Xi Jinping on politics, the economy, foreign and security policy, and in Chinese society, we often just document this without asking ourselves the question, why? And this actually comes back to the enduring questions of ideology in the party's own political and ideational arrangements.
So, Ambassador, extrapolating from that ideological shift, some have argued that there is an intent to that ideological shift is driving an intention to reclaim the quote unquote lost territories, right? Whether it's Taiwan, whether it's South China Sea, East China Sea, even parts of northern India as it adjoins China's land boundary. Taiwan is clearly the most obvious, I think, the most volatile of that long laundry list, but by no means the only flashpoint. You know, I wonder if you could, do a little self-reflection on kind of the West.
We Australians don't do self-reflection.
What can we be doing?
That's a bridge too far.
What can we be doing to lower the temperature in the region? Or is it really, up to the Chinese? They are the ones with their hand on the dial, and it's really up to them to lower the temperature. Talk to me a little bit about this.
If you go to the core questions you've just raised, which is how China's behavior in security policy and foreign policy has changed under Xi Jinping, and where does that fit within the ideological matrix that I ran through before, the way I try to summarize it in my own analysis is Xi Jinping, through deliberate ideological construct, has moved the party more to the Leninist left since 2012-13. He's moved the economy more to the Marxist left since 2017, and really since around about 2014-15 has moved the dial in Chinese foreign security policy posture more towards the nationalist right. And if you deconstruct his writings about all these things, you can aggregate evidence points in each of those categories. So let's take the latter of those, which is the deliberate move of the centre of gravity towards a more nationalist right. Back in 2014, at the party's Central Party Work Conference on Foreign Affairs in November of that year, that's the first time you see the formal abandonment of hide your strength, bide your time, never take the lead. Deng Xiaoping's axiom for the previous 35 years, entrenched before as Deng's diplomatic notes. What did it mean? Work within the existing international system while we grow the productive forces in the economy. So that was an orthodoxy, as I said, prescribed ideologically of the previous 35 years. Whereas what you see emanating from the documents at that stage is a conclusion from Xi Jinping at that party work conference on foreign affairs that we were now entering into a new era, We were now entering into a new period where there would be a struggle, 斗争, for the future of the international system. That's quite alien to what preceded it in the decades prior. So, take that further, what it also said is that at a underpinning level of historical materialist analysis, that China's forces were rising, those of the West declining, 东升西降, that China was moving to the center of stage of world history, that we were now witnessing changes not seen before in 100 years, a reference back to the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. In other words, the doctrine being proposed centrally, ideologically, was it was time to move beyond the straitjacket of the previous foreign policy constraints for the reasons I've just outlined. Where that then dovetails in terms of the immediate region, and let's call it territorial revisionism, that is, China's claim to outstanding territories with a large number of its neighbours when you put it together. Korea, less so. Japan, a lot. Senkaku Diaoyuda in the East China Sea. Taiwan, as we know. South China Sea, in terms of the claimant states, whether they are the Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, or Malaysia, or Brunei. And then, of course, the Sino-Indian border, which you referred to before. So the resolve internally is that it's time not simply to accept the status quo. It's time to move to a new status quo. And if you look at the policy pronounced by Beijing at a declaratory level, reinforced by deployments of military and paramilitary forces in each of those domains, you see quantitative change. And if you looked at the graph of movement, so really the change is like this in the post-2012-2013 period, starting with island reclamation in the South China Sea, which was largely 14-15, and then you see parallel increases in assertive activity in the period since then. So what I assume is that this will continue. And then it's a question of both tactics and strategy as to how much to assert each of those sets of territorial interests at a given time. And to go to the core question you posed, what's the countervailing factor? The extent to which the United States and its allies, or in the case of Taiwan itself, therefore push back in efforts to deter China's continued assertion of what it perceives to be its territorial interests in each of these domains. It is the deterrence factor which either is or is not the moderating force in causing a change in calculus in Beijing.
I want to turn to AUKUS. This, of course, is your trilateral partnership with the United Kingdom, the United States. This is not an initiative without some controversy, and including back home, where two of your fellow formers, Prime Ministers Keating and Turnbull, and others have expressed some skepticism related to costs, related to the ability of the United States to actually deliver Virginia-class submarines. I want you to riff just for a moment on how you would respond to that criticism and what makes this effort worth the risk.
I think the first point for all of us in the Indo-Pacific region to reflect on is what we've just been discussing. The overall balance of power in the Indo-Pacific region has changed, and that the dynamic in bringing about that change is the People's Republic of China under Xi Jinping. You see this both in terms of China's declaratory policy, its operational policy, but also the pattern of its military deployments, and frankly the intensity and speed with which it's expanding its military. One simple factoid. 2010, number of units in the PLA Navy plan, about 200, surface and subsurface. Number of units in the United States Navy in the year 2010, just under 300. Roll the clock on to 2024, number of units in the PLA Navy, surface and subsurface, rising from 200 to just under 400. Number of units in the United States Navy, surface and subsurface, still just under 300. So without being terribly scientific about it, I just pick out one quantitative measure. This objectively changes the balance of power in the region, as China would see it, more in its favour. In fact, its ideological discourse internally reflects that. when it speaks of an emerging multipolar order where Shili Pinghang, the balance of power, is becoming more favorable. This is in China's explicit discourse. So therefore, all of us need to understand, whether in Australia, whether in Japan, the Republic of Korea, whether in India, or whether in Southeast Asia, that the external strategic environment is changing, and that the central dynamic in driving those changes are the ideology of the Chinese leadership, the new deliberately more assertive foreign security policy of the Chinese leadership, and the acquisition and deployment of a whole wider range of military assets in order to give that effect, quite apart from China's expanding economic footprint. So therefore, the first principle for all countries to understand is that change and then to make their responses. So if you look carefully in Australia at the Defence Strategic Review, which was delivered by the Australian government less than a year ago, which embraces within it the AUKUS concept, what you see, consistent with most countries within the region, is Australia now rapidly increasing its investment in its own military. You see the same pattern in the ROK, you see the same pattern in Japan, moving now for the first time to 2% of GDP, Australia rising to 2.4% of GDP, and the Taiwanese increasing their level of effort as well. So within that, the Australian government has decided that a set of assets which assist us in maintaining overall strategic balance together with the United States and allies within the Indo-Pacific, and in supporting our own sovereign interests within our own waterways, and at what is, for us, the third largest EEZ in the world. Australia is quite a large island. There's a truckload of water around it as well. So go look at the map, you know. And we're 27 million people, okay? It's a much smaller population than California. And so therefore, for us, it actually makes sense to therefore acquire these new sets of capabilities. That's the framework within which we're doing what we're doing.
So you are likely unaware, Ambassador, but there's a political campaign happening in this country right now for president.
Well, I hadn't picked that up.
One of those candidates, former President Trump, has noted in the past that this country has a history of negotiating very bad deals with the government in Australia, and has expressed some skepticism.
When did he say that?
Well, he said it a number of times.
I don't think so.
I wonder if, given his even general skepticism about the value of international cooperative agreements like AUKUS, is AUKUS in the security partnership in peril under a potential Trump administration?
Well, first things first. I mean, successive Australian governments have worked with whichever government the United States, the people of the United States elected any presidential election. For example, our military alliance has not only endured but expanded and grown under 14 or 15 Australian prime ministers and about 13 or 14 US presidents, Republican and Democrat, Conservative, and in my case, Labor, when I was Prime Minister of Australia. So we actually don't have a view about, you know, partisan preferences within this country. That's a choice for you all to sort out. Point one. Point two is the AUKUS legislation, which went through under the National Defence Authorization Act at the end of last year in the United States Congress, has gone through with overwhelming support from both Republicans and Democrats in all relevant House and Senate committees. Armed Services Committee, House and Senate, Foreign Relations Committee, House and Senate, Appropriations Committee, House and Senate, Intelligence Committees, House and Senate. So there are a truckload of, in fact, of Republicans of all different hues who have backed this in for the same geopolitical reasons that I just referred to before. Third point is when former President Trump has been asked about this recently, he's indicated no particular reservations about AUKUS, hence why I was querying your cliff notes just before. And I think there's a reason for that. He understands, and what he has said about the importance for each of American allies to pull their own weight in their overall defense outlays, hence part of his critique, for example, of various Europeans whose expenditure is sub 2% of GDP. Well, we're well north of 2% of GDP and going further and further north. And secondly, remember, this is a huge investment in the United States submarine industrial base itself. By purchasing a number of Virginia-class boats from the US through the yards at Huntington Ingalls in Virginia, an electric boat in Groton in Connecticut. These are huge investments from abroad into the expansion of your own submarine industrial base. And on top of the purchase price and buying each one of these boats before we build our own, in our own shipbuilding facility in Adelaide, South Australia, we are also investing separately about $3 billion into the shipyards themselves, that is, building extra capacity. So my understanding is Republicans see this as a good deal, a great deal. And so therefore I challenge the premise as to whether we therefore are likely to anticipate any particular reservation about what's been agreed to on a bipartisan basis under the AUKUS legislation.
So let's stick with the theme of the economy, Ambassador. This administration has really continued the many of the policies of the previous administration vis-a-vis China and taking a tougher line on sanctions, on tariffs, and so forth. And both candidates in the campaign are talking about a tougher line with Beijing moving forward. China remains Australia's largest trading partner. And I wonder if you have any concerns about the implications of a U.S.-China trade war if the U.S. were to impose tougher and new tariffs on China. Are you in agreement with the Harris and Trump approach on a tougher economic line with the Chinese?
Well, we Australians have an abiding strategic doctrine. It's called walking and chewing gum at the same time. And that is, we've been a long-standing strategic ally of the United States for the better part of a century. We've fought in the trenches with American troops in every major war the United States has been involved in the last 100 years. So this is etched deeply into the political firmament and the popular firmament in Australia, whether you vote centre-left or whether you vote centre-right, particularly steeled by the experiences of the Second World War. So this is a given. Secondly, like you all here in the United States, we prosecute our commercial arrangements in the world where we can maximize our exports to whichever markets that we can secure, so long as no fundamental violation of our national security obligations. That's why China has become a large market for us over the years, as it's become a large market for the United States. And because of the size of the Chinese economy, it's become the dominant trading partner, in fact, of most countries in the world. In fact, that is just a fact. Can you therefore navigate adequately these competing realities, or these two sets of realities? Well, we've done so far, including during the beginnings of the US-China trade disputes. You called it a US-China trade war, starting in about 2017, 2018 under President Trump. And so we have no particular, as it were, conceptual difficulty with that. What we need to work through, together with the United States, is what National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan refers to as small yards, high fences, as it relates to critical technologies, as it relates to, for example, how do we manage the future global trade in processed critical minerals. Australia, when you look at the map, you should see it as the periodic table. Those of you who did your year 11 and 12 science at high school, certainly in Australia, the front cover was always the periodic table made up of all this stuff. Not because we were particularly clever at this, we just happen to have a useful piece of real estate. We have them all, we mine most of them, and we process some of them. So the question is, for the future, how do we ensure that that has security of supply, not just for the United States for the future, for example, your OEMs and your renewable energy sectors, but the rest of the free world? These are things that we work on simultaneously, together with critical technologies, with our allies and partners and friends led by the United States.
So, Ambassador, I'm going to turn here to the audience in just 2 minutes. So, if you could be ready to identify yourself to my colleagues, let me give you a quick exit question from me, at least. Obviously, issues of the Indo-Pacific in this country, in the campaign, more broadly, suck up a lot of oxygen. What are we missing? What are the issues that we're missing in the region? What deserves more attention from policymakers here in Washington?
To be fair to well, first of all, when you're having a national election, it doesn't matter where you're having it in the world, overwhelmingly the focus of elections will always be domestic. I mean, the United States is no different to the Commonwealth of Australia. That is, working families are concerned about the cost of living, their ability to find a job, their ability to manage rising prices in what has been, an inflationary environment across most of the world. Ironically, as a consequence of the massive injections we all delivered into our economies to deal with the implosions which came about as a result of COVID, which came about in China. But anyway, these are the preoccupations which naturally occupy people's minds. I've been on Capitol Hill this morning talking to senators. That's the nature of our democracies, as it should be. At a broader level, what I would say, where I give credit to the administration, is the administration has been successful in embracing allies in Asia, in the Indo-Pacific, and in Europe around common strategic challenges. For example, together with our Deputy Prime Minister, I attended the most recent NATO summit, which is called now NATO IP4. So it's the NATO countries, some 32 of them, plus the 4 Indo-Pacs of Korea, Japan, ourselves, and the New Zealanders. Why? Because there is a common strategic preoccupation with China's impact, not just on regional security, but global security, whether through cyber, space, critical minerals, critical technologies, or other domains. So to be fair to the administration, their ability to bring about, for example, the Quad at summit level. We have the Quad Summit convening later this week with my Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, Prime Minister Modi, Prime Minister Kishida, and President Biden. We have AUKUS, which you've just referred to. We have the new trilat strategic collaboration between the United States, Japan, and the ROK. So what I observe is an increasing pattern of activity by the administration in bringing the region, and frankly its 40 plus allies, treaty allies around the world, within a common strategic framework. That is no small feat. Managing the allies is sometimes tricky. And so to give the administration due credit, we should do that. The one thing which I think both sides of American politics need to focus on for the future, whether it's President Trump returning to office or President Harris, it is the question of the abiding economic interests of the wider Indo-Pacific region. Remember, the Trans-Pacific Partnership bit the dust. Remember that we have developed the beginnings of an alternative framework, which is called IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which has as yet incomplete chapters within it on the future of digital trade across the Indo-Pacific. An effective grand strategy for the Indo-Pacific must be not just about classic geopolitics and the military. It must equally be about the economy, trade, and investment. You need both these wings to flap. And so the challenge and the opportunity for an incoming administration is to how to do that effectively. And I say that in not some sort of pious, politically illiterate fashion, because I know how deep the tides of protectionism now are flowing within this country for a whole range of reasons. But if you ask me what needs to be addressed by whichever side of politics prevails at the next election, it's bringing more and more of your allies within the economic tent. And this is not an Australian cri de coeur. Why? Because we've had an FTA, free trade agreement with the United States, for 20 years. This is about us reflecting on the wider neighbourhood and what would be useful in the cause of freedom and open markets worldwide.
So let's turn to the audience. If you identify yourself, my colleague will hand you a microphone. This woman here, right? Yep, that's you. Yeah, thank you. As well, if you could just, out of courtesy, identify yourself and your affiliation. The ambassador assured me in advance he does not need to know your favorite color or where you went to high school. So you're going to demonstrate good practice.
Color? Okay.
Document that were produced by the Australian government, just turned on. In those documents and those reports, there's a really significant, as you mentioned, increase planned for defense investment in Australia, as well as other more kind of specifics, as like further northern bases and more advanced technology and defense technology. I was just wondering if you could give your perspective on whether Australia is growing, I guess, more comfortable in a leadership role in terms of regional security, more confident in a participatory role in a potential Taiwan contingency or other contingencies in the region where they too, spiral, and just your kind of view on how those are, those roles are going to evolve as Australia invests more in its defense sector. And thank you so much for being here.
Hold that thought, Ambassador. We're going to collect a couple more to test your memory here. Let's go Isaac, right behind you. There's a gentleman sitting on the, yep, exactly. Yeah, it'll catch up with you.
Policy advisors on China. At the time, their assessment of the sort of policy situation in the EU was that in the event that the Taiwan contingency takes place, their economic sanctions from the bloc were actually far from guaranteed. And so I was hoping to get a sense of your sense of where allies, aside from maybe Australia and Japan, are when it comes to interest and commitment to the security of the Indo-Pacific. Thank you.
Can you take one more? One more.
Sure.
We're going to go right at the back. Isaac, right behind you again. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Zane. I'm an intern with the Department of State, actually hailing from the University of Oklahoma, so a bit away from home. But my question is, a previous speaker talked about how the U.S. was stretching itself thin in terms of policy with Israel, Gaza, the war in Ukraine, and the Indo-Pacific. So you mentioned how China under Xi has moved more towards changing the international system, or rather changing its place in the international system. Is it possible that China, if not now, potentially in the future, could be stretching itself thin amongst its goals and policies? Thank you.
A cornucopia to choose from.
Good. Cornucopia means lots of corn, doesn't it? Sorry, my pen's leaking all over me, but that's okay. On the question that was raised before about, I think to paraphrase what you said, Australian security policy, quote, leadership, unquote, within the Indo-Pacific. I mean, we have first of all, I think it's just important to underscore what our pan-regional strategic framework is. It's anchored in the realism of maintaining strategic equilibrium, maintaining a favorable military balance from a realist frame. We do not believe that peace and stability and prosperity can be had by a bunch of pixies gathering together at the bottom of the garden for a seminar every second Tuesday in the hope that everyone respects the rules of the pixie meeting at the bottom of the garden. And we have a genuinely realist frame about this stuff. And the reason we have such a realist frame is because of our relatively unique strategic geography and because of our historical experience of the Second World War. And so for those reasons, we see our strategic framework as requiring us to shoulder more of the responsibility in making our contribution to a favourable military balance. So that's the first point. The second is it's done not just within the classical military alone, it's done across a whole range of collaborations with our friends, partners and allies, including in non-military domains and including in cyber and space. So therefore, that's our overarching framework. The other thing for folks here to focus on for a moment is that within our own immediate strategic neighbourhood of Southeast Asia and the Pacific Island countries, Australia has a unique and continuing set of military and foreign policy relationships with all 15 island states in the Pacific Island countries, as well as with the 10 states of ASEAN in Southeast Asia, which go back, frankly, since decolonisation. By and large, our relations with all those countries is in first-class working order, largely because we've never been a colonial power. We're just a bunch of criminals from the United Kingdom. and it's one of the more successful prisons that the British have run. So therefore, our relationship with the 15 Pacific Island countries, we're the only country in the world with embassies in all 15. To give you an insight, development assistance cooperation from Australia to these countries runs at about $2 billion a year. The nearest other country to contribute may be countries like China with 400 or 500 million a year. So we are the dominant development partner and have been for a very long time in this part of the neighbourhood. Doesn't mean there are not challenges, there are. And in Southeast Asia, the fabric of our political and economic, and in some countries, development relationship goes back a very long time. One of the region's sort of minor miracles is if you look at how disparate countries like Indonesia are, with 250, 280 million people, the largest Muslim country in the world, and 27 million of us just to the south, we get on remarkably well. And in fact, our security relationship between the two countries is probably closer than it's ever been. So what we see is part from our broader role within Indo-Pacific, vis-a-vis strategic equilibrium, in our immediate terrain of Southeast Asia and the Southwest Pacific, and all 25 countries represented within that domain, we are very much, as it were, anchors in that, and are happy to continue to play that role. The second set of questions was more about Taiwan, I think. No Australian government, Conservative or Labor, ever speculates publicly on what an Australian government would do in the future, in particular contingencies in relation to Taiwan, mainly because it's impossible to predict what those contingencies might be. Similarly, we see much the same emanating from successive US administrations over time as well. So what therefore is it important to do to ensure that we encourage an environment whereby both Beijing and Taipei can, if they agree, continue to have a political discourse about their common future, matter for them. Second, that this cannot be as a consequence of force. And thirdly, on the question of any unilateral change to Taiwan's political status in the future, we would regard that as problematic if it was engineered internally by the Taiwanese to cross certain fundamental red lines. But at the same time, in terms of Beijing, that it is absolutely clear-cut that Xi Jinping, every day of the week, must reach a calculated conclusion that the risks associated with unilateral military action against Taiwan are far greater than the benefits to be, or the opportunities to be realised by undertaking that course. In other words, deterrence. So our framework for dealing with Taiwan is around those three sets of principles. But we do not, as a matter of government policy and doctrine, comment on particular reactions to particular scenarios, because each of them is going to be sui generis.
The China overstretch question.
Ah, good. Number three, China overstretch. Your memory is good. One of the interesting conversations I've had with Chinese leaders over the years, particularly those in financial and economic policy domains, is around China's sort of own domestic experience of what it's like funding the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, when the BRI was first announced, from memory, around about 15 or 16, it was, if you finally did the maths on, we say maths, by the way, I know you say math, but we're into the plurality of mathematics as opposed to math. But when you do the math or maths, the numbers at the time were around about 3 trillion in terms of the proposed investment, which is not a loose piece of change. That's quite a lot of cash in terms of infrastructure needs across the global south. What I found by the time you get to about 2018, 2019, is the Chinese system was saying privately and internally, that is a lot of money, and we have other demands on cash as well. And there are associated debates within China itself about, do you want to be throwing all this money at countries which may not be, shall we say, optimal investment targets in some cases, when you've got a whole bunch of domestic needs. So if you want a case study of being overstretched, that has been, I think, one of them. The most recent calculus that I have seen in the public domain about the current scope of BRI has been reduced probably from 3 trillion to 1 trillion. Still, not a loose piece of cash, that's a lot of cash. And of course it poses the parallel question to the United States and its partners and allies as to what we're doing through the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, other infrastructure facilities run by our various national governments, whether it's the United States, Japan, Korea, Australia or others, to rise to the challenge of the infrastructure deficits and gaps in much of the global south. That remains a challenge. But I use that as an example of where China has discovered you can't just continue to write checks even when they're in renminbi, because it's a lot of cash.
Ambassador, we could have used a couple more hours of your time here this morning. I'm not going to let you leave the stage until you promise to come back after the publication of your book. So you really can't say no, because you would look really terrible if you said no right now. So you're now obligated.
What I love about Americans, I can predict how you feel.
I want you all just to remain.
I will come back in a private capacity to talk about my book when I take recreational leave in order to do that, so as not to conflict with my public responsibilities as Australian Ambassador to the United States.
You're now obligated. I'm going to ask you all to stay in your seats. We're going to move to two rapid quick-fire conversations, one on Korea, and then we're going to come back again to China. But as we shift the stage, please join me in thanking Ambassador Rudd for his time. Yeah. It's a quick picture here.
All right, well, hello again. We don't get a coffee break this time, so we're just gonna start over. I wanted to pick up on some of the themes that we touched on this morning, and really thinking about how the situation has changed since the last time that the U.S. and North Korea were engaged in negotiations, which was, of course, in 2019. As I mentioned this morning, we have observed that Kim Jong-un's worldview has shifted, as well as his strategy, and especially since that Hanoi summit, which was the last formal summit between Trump and Kim, where they failed to reach an agreement. And we know that was a consequential moment in our relationship that really forced Kim to reevaluate the prospects, opportunities, and benefits of U.S.-DPRK relations. But with my colleague here, Rachel Min-Young Lee, who's a senior fellow in our 38 North program, I wanted to unpack that a little bit of, what do you see as some of the key policy shifts since that moment that will make 2025 a very different negotiating environment for either a Biden or Harris administration?
So I wanted to go back to something that you mentioned earlier, which is the collapse of the Hanoi summit and how that was a consequential moment for Kim Jong-un and his foreign policy. I think the collapse of the summit had was a big moment for Kim, right, and the top leadership circle. And I think the failure to come up with a deal with Trump resulted in in fundamental skepticism on the part of Kim and his top associates.
Especially because he had really raised expectations domestically to the people of North Korea that this was going to happen and that it was going to benefit the North Koreans.
Right. So I think it aroused fundamental skepticism on the part of Kim and the top associates about the utility of the U.S., whether it was worth trying to normalize relations, keep trying to normalize relations with the U.S. through denuclearization. And at the same time, I think North Korea started to realize that it could benefit from what we call great power competition, right? The strategic, the shifts in the geopolitical order. And I think it also started to realize what it perceived as declining leadership of the U.S. on the global stage. So I think those two things came together to result in a fundamental shift in North Korea's foreign policy. More specifically, North Korea walking away from its 30-plus year policy of trying to normalize relations with the U.S. through denuclearization. And that void, I think, Pyongyang tried to fill by realigning with China and with Russia.
And certainly that creates a situation where there's also less urgency in getting a deal with the United States. Because if one of the underlying motivations for North Korea-U.S. rapprochement was the lifting of sanctions, right now North Korea has an opportunity to cultivate relations with more sympathetic states that don't care as much about sanctions implementation. And certainly with the Russians now are willing to openly defy them and create systems that really circumvent the U.S. dollar-led economy and create opportunities for economic and political development and cooperation without sacrifice, without North Korea having to sacrifice anything for it. So I think this morning we also talked a little bit about North Korea's risk tolerance, this idea that what North Korea is willing to do is take a lot more risks than what the U.S. And South Korea are willing to do in order to really challenge the status quo in the region. And I think, we've seen this play out, especially in terms of North Korea's WMD advancements, a number of missile tests, a number of nuclear tests over the years, in open defiance of international law, of UN Security Council resolutions. But we've also seen North Korea in recent years, codify their nuclear program and strategy into law, into their constitution, into their identity. We've also, earlier this year, we saw them reject the notion that peaceful reunification can be achieved and declare themselves a sovereign state, designating South Korea as their principal enemy. This is a very significant change in its stance in inter-Korean relations and really forces us to think differently about the future of the Korean Peninsula. But there are some other developments that we know are coming up that North Korea has not only hinted at, but has sort of openly said they're ready to do, and we now need to wait and see what those developments are going to be. But Rachel, I wonder if you can take us through what some of those expectations are.
So North Korea will be holding a parliamentary session on October 7th. It's the Supreme People's Assembly. It was supposed to be held in September, but for some reason it's been delayed by about a month. And they confirmed that they will be revising the Constitution. And we expect, if we go back to what Kim Jong-un said in January 2024, he talked about the need to define DPRK territory in the Constitution. And in that same sentence, he also said that he couldn't recognize the northern limit line, which is the inner Korean maritime boundary. So we can expect in the upcoming Supreme People's Assembly session, they'll be revising the Constitution to that effect. Some clause about defining DPRK territory and possibly something about the northern limit line. And the problem with that is depending on how they define DPRK territory, I think that leaves room for a conflict with South Korea. We know that North Korea started to build a wall along the DMZ to reinforce the idea that South Korea and North Korea are two different or separate states instead of one Korean nation. And historically, there have been naval clashes in the Yellow Sea along or near the northern limit line. So I think depending on how the Constitution is revised, we can expect to see some limited conflict.
And I know one of the major concerns is not only the maritime border itself, if they create borders versus boundaries, and how much that aligns with convention right now of the northern limit line. But is this question as well of the DMZ, right? If they, where they might draw that border for the country, whether it's the military demarcation line, which is in the middle of the DMZ, or that northern limit of the DMZ itself. And if it is the military demarcation line, it really forces us to rethink the armistice agreement. It is in violation of the armistice agreement. And will really cause a lot of need. It will really challenge the status quo on North and South Korea, how we monitor the DMZ, the role of the UN command in that process, and the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission, and what happens to the DMZ after that. Can it still exist if now you have a border instead of just a boundary? So again, like all of these things are moves that North Korea is willing to be decisive on and not only hint at as a way to tell us what's coming, but really follow through on. And we expect if they say this is going to happen, we've seen them over and over tell us and telegraph to us that this is what they're thinking, and that's actually the actions that they take. And suddenly for some reason, we're always surprised when they actually go through with it. But I wonder, there's a lot of narrative of the why now. A lot of questions about why are they doing this now? And certainly North-South relations have not been good since 2019. But why force these moves now? And Rachel, I wonder if you can comment on, how much do you think US elections might be playing into the signaling that we're seeing from North Korea and the timing of some of the moves that they're making?
That's a really good question because a lot of experts have commented on the timing of North Korea's recent actions and kind of connecting them to the US presidential election. I think we have to, first of all, I think we have to be very careful about tying what we call North Korean provocations to major US political events unless we have a strong set of data to prove that. I, for one, don't really have that baseline, so I can't say definitively that North Korea tends to engage in provocations in the lead up to U.S. presidential elections. For nuclear tests, the past 6 nuclear tests, I know that there is not a clear correlation between the past 6 nuclear tests and U.S. presidential elections or any major U.S. political events. So going back to your question, I think there is some connection between North Korea's latest actions. I mean, for example, Kim Jong-un's visit to the uranium facility last week and the upcoming U.S. presidential election. I don't think we can deny that there is no connection. There is a connection between North Korea's actions and what is happening in the U.S. right now in the political scene. That said, I think we should also look at some of the other things that are taking place. What's happening domestically, what has been happening domestically, and also what is happening between the Russians and the North Koreans. So whenever North Korea does something, and the bigger the action, the more complicated the calculus is. It's never just about the US. You have to look at everything holistically, right? What's going on domestically. Because when they take a major step, and to cite the uranium facility visit last week as an example, that was a very provocative move and one that was very calculated. And Kim Jong-un would not have done that just out of consideration for the US presidential election. I think there were domestic factors driving it. I think it was also what's happening between North Korea and Russia.
What are some of the domestic factors that you think played into that decision?
I think it's mainly 2 things. I think Kim Jong-un wants to instill pride in the domestic populace, especially in the wake of the devastating floods in some of the provinces in North Korea in early August. I think they needed that. And secondly, there's been a real push domestically inside North Korea to justify why North Korea needed to continue to invest in the defense industry, and why that needs to be prioritized over the civilian economy. So I think there are two angles to that too, domestically. And it's interesting because we keep talking about the timing of Kim Jong-un's visit to the uranium facility last week to the presidential debate that also happened to have taken place around the same time. I think we also have to think about the first-year anniversary of Kim's visit to the Russian Far East for his summit with Putin, and the fact that Shoigu, one of Putin's confidants, I think he's the chair of the Security Council or a member of the Security Council of Russia, he visited Pyongyang the day after North Korea released the image of Kim Jong-un visiting the uranium facility. So I think we have to take all of those things into account, not just the U.S. presidential election.
Great. Well, as North Korea does continue to invest in its military, its defenses, and especially its asymmetric capabilities and asymmetric against South Korean capabilities, this, of course, raises anxieties in Seoul, the other side of the equation, and one where there's been increasing demands for assurances from the United States for greater nuclear cooperation. We've seen this lead to the Washington Declaration, the establishment of a bilateral nuclear consultative group, the beginning of conventional nuclear integration, a real emphasis on deepening the alliance, and as well as bolstering extended deterrence given North Korea's growing capabilities. This all happened, though, under the Biden administration, because under the first Trump administration, relations between the U.S. and South Korea were not good. And for some reason, Trump seemed to be especially antagonistic to the South Koreans. I think going forward, what is your expectation of U.S.-South Korea relations under either a Trump or a Harris administration?
I think we have to be careful, right, because we don't know very much about what a Harris foreign policy might look like. But if we assume that it'll be along the lines of what we have been seeing under the Biden administration, I think that we will continue to see a lot of emphasis from the U.S. government on the alliance, on trilateral security cooperation among the U.S., ROK, and Japan. However, under a Trump presidency, I think we will see a lot more pressure on the U.S.-ROK alliance. I don't think that we can expect that strong, sticky trilateral cooperation between the U.S. and ROK and Japan. I think that South Korea will, the nuclear debate that came up before in South Korea, I think there is a likelihood, great likelihood actually, of that surfacing again. Because there's a lot of concern already in Seoul about the possibility of the U.S. asking the South Koreans to shoulder more defense cost sharing, which was an issue in the past under the first Trump administration. Trump has also referred to the joint U.S.-ROK military drills as war games and expensive. So I think there's going to be concern also in South Korea about whether those will continue, because South Koreans tend to see those as being a core element of the U.S. ROK alliance and, of course, extended deterrence. So there's definitely predictably unpredictable dynamic might, or we can foresee might unfold in the region should Trump be reelected.
And I think we've seen this, too, from potential Trump administration people cycling through Seoul, talking about why it could be beneficial to have, for instance, a South Korean nuclear capability to help lessen the burden on the U.S. nuclear arsenals as well. And certainly the notion of being able to have both the alliance in some form as well as a South Korean nuclear capability is one that the South Koreans, I think, have them pretty excited to think about. What do you make of South Korea's recent appointment of the new defense minister, especially given his views on South Korean nuclearization?
I think the appointment of the current defense minister was foreseen. I mean, he's always been a close confidant of President Yoon, and there were rumors that he was actually going to be the first defense minister, but instead he took up the position of the head of the presidential, the Secret Service. I think it's he didn't exclude the possibility of South Korea going nuclear, but he didn't exactly say that South Korea should go nuclear either. But I think it's the official position of the Yoon government so far, as of now, is extended deterrence. That's the core of South Korea's security. So,
great. So I think our time is up. And we are going to move next to our next rapid fire. Thank you, everyone, for listening to our discussion on the Korean Peninsula. Our next segment is going to be a China quickfire with Stimson's China Program Director, Yoon Soon, who you've seen earlier today, as well as our senior fellow, Kelly Greco. And we are pleased to welcome them in. Thank you very much.
Over here. Okay, cool. We still have a full room.
Yes,
that's
wonderful.
that's a great success.
So why don't you reintroduce yourself again?
Okay, Yoon Soon. I work on China. I lead the China program here at the Stimson. Also work quite a bit with my colleagues who work on Indo-Pacific strategy across the region, and you have seen some of our expertise and our directors in this region earlier this morning.
I'm Kelly Greco. I'm a senior fellow with the Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy program here at the Stimson Center, and I work on future of war, as well as U.S. alliances and partnerships in the Indo-Pacific. So, all right, I'm going to start by kicking us off, and I know this question's come up already, but given what is everyone's thinking about in D.C., I'm going to ask it anyway. There's an elephant or donkey in the room today, given the U.S. presidential election. So how would U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy, in your view, change under a Harris or a Trump administration?
Great question. We did talk a little bit about this, especially in the China context this morning. I would say that for people who are assessing what Harris China policy will look like, I think people do expect a lot of continuity. Some of the policies that have already been pursued by the Biden administration, I think people expect those policies to continue. So it will be a competition-oriented strategy towards China, but focused on building our strengths, building alliances and partnerships in the region so that we have a broadest coalition to compete with China effectively. I think the more interesting question is what the Indo-Pacific strategy of a Trump administration would look like. Because after all, if people do recall, in November of 2017, it was President Trump who first announced the Indo-Pacific strategy when he was traveling to the region. I think at least on the China front, people expect a lot more uncertainty, volatility, and unpredictability in terms of Trump's China policy, which one could argue that is one of his strengths, because when his policy is unpredictable, I think it makes it much more difficult for China to prepare or to react to those policies. And if you look at the track record, one could also argue recently that under the first Trump administration, U.S. was able to extract more cooperation from China on the issue of North Korea compared to any other previous administrations. So there will be two very different approaches, two very different trajectories in terms of the China policy. But you work a lot on the partnerships and alliances in the region. What do you think that the two different potential administrations would entail for the Indo-Pacific strategy?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. I think they would both, to a certain degree, work on strengthening alliances and partnerships, because I think even Trump administration would recognize that there is a need for allies and partners, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, given the scope of the China challenge. But they would diagnose the problem very differently. So I think in a Harris administration, she would be more likely to diagnose it externally. And what I mean is that there aren't really fundamental problems with the alliances and partnerships themselves, but that the real problem is trying to figure out how to aggregate these things together. So this is the Biden administration moving away from the hub and spoke model to this lattice work. So I think she would very much focus on consolidating this lattice work and trying to institutionalize it. And so one place you might see that is AUKUS Pillar 2, and moving forward with an effort to try to bring in other countries in the region. Japan, New Zealand have been mentioned. In contrast, I think Trump would look much more internally at the alliances and partnerships themselves and diagnose them to be problematic, and that he would see them as unfair deals for the United States. The focus would really be on unfair burden sharing. And so I think even close allies like Japan, for example, could be in for some rougher seas, and that, yes, they're increasing their budget by 60% over the next 5 years, though the weakening yen is cutting into that. I think that what they would hear from the Biden administration, from the Trump administration, though, is that it's too slow and it's not enough. And so, again, that emphasis on burden sharing in particular. The one place, though, that I think, interestingly, that they would almost be a little bit similar is that I would expect either administration to move away from the framing of strategic competition in terms of democracy and autocracy, which is interesting. That's been sort of a hallmark of the Biden administration. But if you go and carefully look at Harris's speeches, some speeches and her remarks at the Democratic Convention, she's avoided that language and favored the rules-based order, when she talks about that, perhaps as a lawyer, that appeals to her. So I think and there's been some private reporting to suggest that she's not a huge fan of that framing, in part because it doesn't really work well in the region. It's a math problem. And of course, Trump is not someone who really sees the world in ideological terms. It's much more interest-based and transactional. So it would be surprising to see him embracing that language as well. But I think that would be a good thing for the region, simply because that framing doesn't really work very well, given the number of liberal democracies in the region is small relative to the number of countries.
Yeah, and we have seen the backsliding of democracies in some of these countries in the region as well. So it's going to be a tricky question. No, I think you're absolutely correct. This rule-based order does resonate quite a bit. Although, if you look at the last 2 years, for example, of the Trump administration, one of the observations that people have made is this strong tone of regime delegitimization about China, right? This dictatorship or authoritarianism, Chinese Communist Party being the source of the problem. I think it will be interesting to see whether that continues.
Yeah, so that brings up an interesting question, which is, it's hard to believe we're almost a year to the San Francisco summit between Biden and Xi, and an attempt, to stabilize relations. And I'm curious, thinking about that, do you think the San Francisco formula has worked? And what are the prospects for it, in your view, continuing?
Great question. Has it worked? I think it depends on worked for what. What is the goal that we're trying to achieve here? I think for the San Francisco summit, the administration, at least from external observation point of view, the goal is to stabilize the relationship, right? Because by the balloon incident, the relationship was highly volatile. It was extremely unpredictable, faced with the potentiality of derailment. So I think to using the terms, responsibly manage the competition and to prevent the potential military conflict between the two great powers, I think San Francisco summit was quite useful. It was quite effective in producing that goal. Although one could also raise the question that with China's economic slowdown, with China being generally trying to, I would say, tone down, we have seen the toning down of the wolf warrior diplomacy, that China trying to tone down its assertive stance in many issues. So one could also argue that, well, maybe that potentiality of military conflict was not going to come true anyway. But I would say that after San Francisco summit, we have seen these relationships becoming more stabilized. It is stabilizing. But let's not forget that the fundamental framework of this relationship is that it is fundamentally unstable because of the structural conflict, because of the two very different worldviews, and also two very different visions for example, security architectures in the region, and also what that rule-based order should look like, right? So I think that's a summary for the current status of the relationship after San Francisco. It is stabilizing, but it's fundamentally unstable. We're seeing that the Beijing and Washington making some genuine effort to address some of these long-standing issues between the two countries. Like this past weekend, we saw the first prisoner, we saw the release of the American national being detained in China since 2006, being released back to the United States. I think that's the fruit from diplomatic engagement and from diplomatic negotiation, which would not have been possible without the general atmosphere that we have seen since San Francisco summit.
I'm curious, just thinking about it a little bit from the Chinese perspective, do they see the United States as honoring their promises at San Francisco? Because in DC, we focus very much on whether China's honoring agreements to us, but the Chinese perspective.
I think it depends on what you see the agreement is. I think that's the biggest mystery, right? How do you quantify or qualify what the agreement really was? Because it's not a clear transaction that China will deliver this and the U.S. will deliver this. I think we have seen more Chinese cooperation on the issue of fentanyl and the issue of precursor, the fentanyl precursor. And we are seeing on one issue, we could say that the Chinese have delivered, which is on the resumption of the meal-to-meal dialogue. The last item that was agreed upon last November, the direct communication between the theater command, between the commanders of the theater command, that took place earlier this month. And I believe the CHOD summit, the CHOD meeting, Chief of Defense meeting that's taking place in Honolulu this week, I think the Chinese are also participating in that. So you could say that Chinese are delivering on the meal-to-meal dialogue. But at the same time, if you look at the longer track record, that's a very different story. Yeah. Coming to the region, earlier in our sessions, we also talked about the countries in the region trying to either hedge or trying to balance trying to survive in the U.S.-China great power competition, right? And one assumption or one calling that we have repeatedly heard is don't force us to choose. And I always feel that, well, lucky that you have choices. So in your view, that this resistance to be forced to choose or the resistance to take position between U.S. and China in the great power rivalry, do you think that's a sustainable position? I'm always curious about that.
Yes, I think this is a great question and a big one. I would just say, in DC, I sort of see two schools of thought emerging on this. In the sort of the mainstream conventional wisdom is what I would call the just wait school, which is essentially, that states, yes, they're hedging right now, they're gathering more information, they're saying they don't want to choose, but as China reveals more its true intentions, it behaves more, engages in more bullying behavior in the South China Sea, it behaves more aggressively with disinformation campaigns, things like that, countries will ultimately start to see China as a bigger and bigger threat, both its capabilities growing and its intentions. And when that happens, ultimately, they're going to need to align with one or the other side, and they're more likely to decide to balance against China rather than bandwagon with it and join, the United States side, basically to seek protection from China with a closer relationship with the United States. And what I would say is the other school, and this is one that I'm part of because I've written on this extensively, is what I call the multi-alignment school. And says that that's actually a really flawed understanding of what's happening in the Indo-Pacific, particularly in Southeast Asia, and that countries have actually made a choice already. They're not indecisive. They're not waiting to gather more information. They've picked a third way, which is multi-alignment. And so they don't see the choice before them in the terms that we portray it in Washington as a choice between China and the United States. They've decided that's not the choice, and in fact, they are going to align with multiple states. So on certain issues, it will be with China when it aligns with their interests. They want a relationship with the United States as well. But they also want a relationship with other major actors, India, European states as well. And so it's going to be very issue-specific alignments. And what I think is often missed in these conversations is that particularly maritime Southeast Asia is in a position to actually pursue this strategy in part because of the geography. We take a lot of assumptions from Europe and our experience in the Cold War and kind of apply them onto the Indo-Pacific, but the geography is very different there. And so many of these maritime states, islands, archipelagic states, are surrounded by water, which is highly protective. It means that their threat environment is not as severe as it would be if they were living on the continent. And so it gives them more options. So they don't see the same need to align closely with the United States. They don't really necessarily perceive China as an existential threat. Yes, they see that its behavior is highly problematic, but not an existential threat. I remember one Malaysian defense expert I spoke to telling me that he thought Malaysia would see China as an existential threat when its invasion fleet showed up in its harbor. That's when they would be convinced of that. And so what this means, though, is you can't really change geography. And so if you're thinking that these countries are going to move off of this sort of neutral or multi-aligned position, it's going to be really hard to do because the geography is constant. And so the reality is I think U.S. policy needs to come to terms with this fundamentally and understand that what we're going to see in the Indo-Pacific are a lot of shifting alignments, very issue specific, and kind of maybe getting away from this cottage industry of every time there's some new agreement, that we write a series of op-eds saying, Vietnam's tilting towards the United States, and then 3 weeks later it's tilting towards China. We lost Vietnam. So it's a much more complex reality and one that we need to learn how to navigate in a smarter way.
It's certainly very dynamic. I was in Malaysia in June for the Asia Pacific Roundtable, and to my greatest surprise, I saw demonstrations against the United States quite prevalently in the city. They were demonstrating against Apple, against Coca-Cola, Starbucks, and it was primarily because of Gaza.
I was about to say, I would have thought, Gaza.
Yeah, so if you look at the ASEA's public opinion survey earlier this year, I think the issue of Gaza does flare very significantly how the region perceives U.S. and China.
That's very true. So let me get to maybe moving a little bit, thinking about the future. And so we want very specific predictions, just kidding. So as we think, if you were advising the next administration, whichever administration it is, what would you warn them about being the biggest flashpoint potentially in U.S.-China relations?
That's a great question. If you look at China's primary theater, it's definitely to its east on the Pacific side, right? And I would say that the region of West Pacific is where we have seen most contentious relationship between U.S. and China, because that's where the two great powers clashes, the two visions for security architectures clashes. That's also where U.S. alliance system clashes with what the Chinese see as their doorsteps. So I think for the West Pacific, that's most likely where we're going to see potential problems and potential flashpoints. And from north to south, we say that West Pacific, there are 4 issues. There's Korean Peninsula, there's East China Sea, there's Taiwan, and then there's South China Sea, right? I think enough deliberation has gone into the Taiwan question that whether it's Davidson window 2027 or it's 2032, I think the policy circle has come to a general consensus that it's very unlikely for China to take military actions against Taiwan in the next, say, 5 years. More than that, we don't know. Primarily because China's own capacity constraints, that if China does take the approach, they will have to be concerned about whether they can win. Then I think what we're seeing in terms of West Pacific is that the flashpoints are more likely to be focused, to be concentrated between China and U.S. allies and partners. Whether it is South Korea, or it is Japan in the South China Sea, or it is what we're seeing today, Philippines in the South China Sea. I think that's where we're more likely to see potential even clashes or potential escalation of tension. I think this is a reflection of a primary judgment on the Chinese side that is still early, it's still premature for China to challenge U.S. predominance, especially militarily in the region. But I think the Chinese approach is that, well, if U.S. is not yet a tenable goal, then maybe U.S. alliances and U.S. partners in the region, especially those with conflict of interest with China, are the better targets. Because like what we have seen in terms of the Second Thomas Show and the Sabina Show, China is challenging and trying to test the bottom line or the boundary of U.S. commitment. And we see this on the Second Thomas Show in particular, that China keeps pushing, keeps going after the resupply missions by the Filipino Navy, Filipino Coastal Guard, to test at what point U.S. would intervene and how. I think that's going to be a more potentially, I would say, contentious point that we will be watching, that China not clashing with U.S. directly, but China testing where U.S. bottom line is in terms of supporting its allies and partners in the region. So I would say that Korean Peninsula, East China Sea and South China Sea are more likely to be the flashpoints compared to Taiwan.
I would agree with you. I would probably put South China Sea at the top of that list myself.
Just wait till North Korea does something.
True, but at least in terms of something that would maybe get the United States and China directly into a conflict. But I think particularly the fact that we don't have a lot of rules of the road around these interactions and the number of aggressive maneuvers we're seeing, clashes, it's the potential, I think, for accident or inadvertent escalation is much higher than we often perceive, although perhaps the hazard is lower because it's not happening on land and it's happening at sea. That might be part of it, but I think your instincts on the fact that it's about Philippines being a U.S. ally, I think, is quite important, which raises interesting questions about what kind of risks the United States should or shouldn't run.
And it will be interesting to see how Harris administration versus the Trump administration will respond to that. It raises so many interesting questions.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for this conversation. I know you need to run to a roundtable, but to close us out, we have a special message from former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. So I'll let the video play.
Mr. Brian Finlay, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Stimson Center, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Let me first extend my warmest congratulations on the occasion of the 35th anniversary of the Stimson Center. And I'm honored to be part of the celebrations to mark this meaningful milestone. Established several months before the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the Stimson Center certainly warrants our special tributes and accolades for its pioneering efforts over the past 35 years toward the maintenance of international stability and security in an increasingly uncertain world. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, for over 3 decades, the Stimson Center has been a leading voice on pressing global issues. Meaningfully founded in the twilight of the Cold War, the center took practical steps then to elevate security during great changes. Today, active efforts to address global tensions based on the spirit of innovation, independence, and pragmatism are now needed more than ever. These are the same values that the Stimson Center has consistently championed. The center's unwavering dedication to finding solutions for peacekeeping and protecting civilians in conflict zones, even in the face of emerging threats, is highly commendable. In fact, I believe that the United Nations and the Stimson Center share a common vision, particularly in their mutual dedication to promoting global peace, security, sustainable development, and human rights. Indeed, both organizations proactively seek pragmatic solutions to address vital and timely global issues. Drawing from my personal experience as the 8th UN Secretary General, I can attest to how critical these viable solutions are in addressing the world's most complex challenges. For instance, it is exemplary that the Stimson Center has made continued efforts to strengthen the non-proliferation of nuclear, chemical, biological, and radiological materials through its safety devices and practical programs. At the same time, The Center's ongoing dedication to developing concrete measures to implement the non-proliferation of requirements set forth by the UN Security Council Resolution 1540 is worthy of deep respect. While many may simply understand the problems and make recommendations, the Stimson Center goes further by presenting robust plans and actionable proposals. Furthermore, the Center has consistently translated excellent forward-thinking ideas into tangible reality by field testing innovative proposals and supporting their implementation on the ground in the real world. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I take this opportunity to communicate my sincere appreciation for providing me with the opportunity to share this message in celebration of the Stimson Center's landmark 35th anniversary. Reiterating my sincere congratulations on this remarkable milestone, I am confident that the Center will continue to advance international security and shared prosperity for the next 35 years and beyond. I thank you for your attention.
For joining the Stimson Center Morning Conference, Security, Strategy, and Diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific. The event has been recorded and will be available at stimson.org. There, we encourage you to check out the Stimson Center's new Indo-Pacific initiative and to learn more about the body of Indo-Pacific research, analysis, and engagement that Stimson is doing here at the center. And a special thanks, of course, to our guest speakers this morning, Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, Daniel Crittenbrink, former Australian Prime Minister and Australia's Ambassador to the United States, the Honorable Kevin Rudd, and of course, former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. Thank you very much and have a great day.